Hello and welcome to GatherVerse News Unscripted, your home for humanity-based tech journalism. Today is Juneteenth, and we are taking a moment to take a look at where we stand in America today when it comes to access to opportunity for people of color, and particularly for Black Americans. Our guest today is Kimberly Bryant. She is the founder of the newly announced Black Innovation Lab and a tech titan. If you know anything about this industry, you know this woman. She has been building in this space for many years. Kimberly, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Priya. It's really an honor to be here and have this conversation.
So, Kimberly, when you think about Juneteenth and where you would like to focus our energies and our attention today, where would you like to put that spotlight?
So when I think about Juneteenth and what this holiday means, it's really, I want to say the foundational aspect is this conversation around freedom and what that meant, hundreds of years ago for those enslaved African Americans in Texas who didn't realize they were free for so many years after emancipation. I think if we look at where we are now within this country as an African American society, I think we have some of the same ills that our ancestors encountered. But when we look at things such as economics and equity and ownership, and I think part of this conversation for me and with Black Innovation Lab is really focusing the aperture of what freedom means from an economic lens and how we get free through this process of creating opportunity for more ownership.
And I know you've spent a lot of time really digging into these questions of racial equity when it comes to who owns what and what that
Mhm.
means for generational wealth, power, influence. What can you share with us about the statistics of the lay of the land right now?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work around this notion of the racial equity wealth gap. And there's some numbers that I pulled in some data from the Federal Reserve out of St. Louis that said that the average white Caucasian family has an average wealth of about 184K, $184,000. That's home equity, that's the assets that they own, that is things such as real estate, that is things such as any bonds, stocks, etc., investments that they have. When you counter that and compare that to both African American and Hispanic numbers and families, that number is significantly exponentially different. So African American families have only about 23,000 in terms of accumulated wealth.
A
Hispanic,
huge difference.
huge difference. Hispanic families have a little bit more than that, 38K in accumulated wealth, but still you see this wide gap between the nearest counterpart in terms of their white families or peers. And this number for African Americans has not changed in 20 years. So like in 20 years, the gap has not lessened. It's only widened. And I think when you looked at the numbers in the research for Hispanic families, there was a small contraction of the gap, but it's still quite significant, as you can see. And so I think when we look deeper into these numbers, it said that in the absence of any policy interventions or other forces that would lead to wealth accumulation in African American and Hispanic families, there was no chance whatsoever that these numbers would converge. And if so, it would be quite impossible. And so for me, that is really the thesis of my work with Black Innovation Lab, because when we talk about what the government interventions might be, policy changes, reparations, perhaps, that is a big policy issue, not only at the federal level, at the state level. But I think another way to focus on closing that gap is creating opportunities and vehicles for wealth accumulation through entrepreneurship. And that's the goal and the focus of Black Innovation Lab.
So we actually have a picture that you shared with us of three African American men. And this is a picture of entrepreneurship. This is a picture of where Americans were sort of headed. This is an older picture in the
Mhm.
past, and we'll throw that up. But while we're looking at that and these gentlemen, Tell us about what they represent for you, what their story was, and what happened to their trajectory. Because it's not a very happy story, and it's one that we're working to correct.
Yes. So Robert Church is the gentleman you see on the far left in this picture, and this picture was taken in Memphis, Tennessee. That is my hometown, by the way. I'll put that in. It's another reason why Black Innovation Lab is being created there. But he was one of the first African American millionaires, and he was a very astute businessman in the Memphis area and beyond who accumulated wealth at the turn of the 20th century and really was, I want to say, a beacon of what Black progress meant for African Americans that were in this age of, the Black Wall Streets, if you will. And these businessmen were really coming into their own. But unfortunately, he had a counterpart, I want to say a counterpart, or perhaps a antagonist in his story was Handy, who was another white businessman in Memphis, Tennessee, that did not like to see this wealth progression in Black communities. And they really started to attack them and physically attack their businesses and their homes. And a lot of those homes, and sorry, I'm about to sneeze. A lot of those homes that these Black businessmen created, literally in the area where we're building Black Innovation Lab, were destroyed. And then they put up public housing. And so that started this turn of events, I would say, in Memphis, Tennessee, where Black entrepreneurism and Black economic development started this downward cycle that continues to this day. And so I think of the work of Black Innovation Lab being really driven by this legacy, this ancestral memory, if you will, of where we started as building as Black entrepreneurs in the city and how we can return to that through technology and creating this startup ecosystem there.
And talk to me about why you decided to create this lab there. You've got that history that you were talking to me about, but there is the need for this sort of economic advancement, even here in the Bay Area where we both live.
Absolutely. So, in my prior life, if you will, in the tech industry, I was very much focused on creating a tech talent pipeline. And I was driven to do that because I am an engineer myself. I graduated at the end of the 80s with a degree in electrical engineering and computer science. And that was a peak time for women receiving those degrees in computer science. It was about 23% or so, maybe 30%, depending on which study you look at.
And that was the peak time?
That was the peak. And if you look at those numbers today, you'll see that women maybe receive about 12 to 14%, but African American women and Hispanic women, it ranges between 1 and 3% at best of the bachelor's degrees awarded in CS. So instead of the wave of women and marginalized communities rising with the tide of computer science, it actually exponentially dropped. That also, though, translates into women and Black-led startups when you look at the startup ecosystem from a creations perspective. There was about $445 billion raised in venture capital in 2022, but only about 2% of that went to women-led startups. And for Black startups, that number was about 1%. So that's a problem. Not only are we not represented in the industry from a perspective of being the engineers and the computer scientists and technologists, we're not even adequately compensated, if you will, with that seed capital to be the builders of these businesses and the founders of these new companies. Right. That is a problem. And that is another driver of this huge racial equity wealth gap that we see to persist throughout the last 100 years.
I just want to highlight what you are saying here. You're pointing out that not only is there not very much money in the venture space going towards people of color or women. And let's point out when it comes to women funding or funding for women in the VC space, not only was it about 2%, actually less than 2% in 2022, it actually dropped from the year before from 2.4% to 1.9%. And earlier you talked about how for Black wealth in this country that it really hasn't changed much in the last 20 years, which seems to stand in stark opposition to all of the social movements that we see and the focus on the need to redress these historical harms in the African
Mhm.
American community. So there's a lot of talk, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem like there's a lot of action. So we appreciate what you're doing in terms of trying to actually make pathways for change. Tell us
Mhm.
about what your lab is going to do.
So I'm really excited about this opportunity to build Black Innovation Lab. As you and I were talking before, I see it as a natural progression from my work with Black Girls Code into now getting on the other side of the table, if you will, and being one of the folks that can actually be an investor in some of these companies. But I think for me, the power and the differential for Black Innovation Lab is that I'm not building this in either the Bay Area or New York, maybe even one of the hot new tech spots, Miami. I'm actually going home. So this is a bit of a homecoming for me and taking the lab back to Memphis, Tennessee and building in the US South. We see a convergence of venture capital on either of the coastlines, but very little proportionally in the Midwest and certainly in the US South, whereas over 56% of African Americans actually reside in the US South. So I love this quote that I've known for many years from the Frida and Mitch Kapoor that says, you know, talent is everywhere. Equity is not. Equity and opportunity is not. So if we think of that lens of going where talent lives and being investors in those communities, there's a huge upside potential from an investment standpoint and an opportunity to pour some of those gains back into the communities and uplift the communities as we rise as well.
Well, you're no stranger to raising money. You have raised capital yourself before. Tell us what you've sort of learned from those lessons that you would pass on to others.
Oh, that's a great question. I think in my prior initiative, I was really raising from a lens of philanthropy, and so you kind of have to lean into folks' capacity to do well. But I think this path is a little bit different, and I think you can do good and do well at the same time. So mission-driven companies are also able to generate huge profits. And I think the conversation and that frame of reference is very important to the work that I'm doing now from a fundraising perspective. But I think at the end of the day, for founders and entrepreneurs, relationships are key. As always, it's having those relationships and building those relationships before you need them and before you need to make an ask, especially in a climate like today when capital is so very tight and folks are not really ready to be as, I want to say, generous as they were in the last couple of years. The relationships is going to be more than important in terms of making those asks and getting to the final raise.
All right. Kimberly Bryant, founder of the Black Innovation Lab, just announced this month to launch in 2024. Is that right?
2024, that's correct.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me and supporting our work. Truly appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. And for all of you watching, thank you so much for joining us here on GatherVerse News Unscripted. If you have a story idea, someone you'd like to see us interview, we would love to hear from you. Go to gatherversenews.org, click on the news link, and then there's a little box there that you can submit your story idea. Very easy and quick to do. Come on back tomorrow at noon for the next episode of GatherVerse News Unscripted. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking with reporter Itai Hod about how he has started to incorporate virtual storytelling into his regular, everyday street reporter work at KPIX in San Francisco. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.